Yeah, so the Nevada caucus. Yeah, it's very similar to what happens in Iowa in terms of it being a caucus, but there are some twists. One of the big ones is going to be this early voting. I don't know how much you guys have followed this. What the latest I saw was something like 75,000 people have already voted early. They had 85,000 or so in 2016, which was down from the 2008 number, which was around 118,000. So it's always tough to tell with early voting whether you're cannibalizing day of voting or you're going to see a bump because of enthusiasm and you just get these people turned out. But that's one thing we're going to be watching for. But yeah, let's talk about the sort of the elephant in the room about how this is going to work. There have obviously been some concerns based on day 18 of Iowa. They were going to use very similar technology to Iowa, and the Nevada Democrats, in the wake of what happened, really have apparently just torn that plan up and put another one in place, which is good because they won't have the problems they had in Iowa. The problem may be they may have their own problems because they're trying to put this together on the fly. It's really the old story about building the airplane in flight at the moment, and whether or not there's going to be sufficient time to train people how to use the new tools. They're very clear that it's not an app; it's tools. It's commercially available Google stuff for the most part, combined with iPads. But it really does come down to whether or not they're going to have the time to train people how to do this. Now, on top of the technology issue, Nevada had a second twist that was always going to be different, and that is that early voting. And the challenge there is if you voted in one of the early voting in the last 3 or 4 days, your vote has to be taken and connected up with your home precinct. That strikes me. You guys are the data people. That strikes me as maybe not the hardest thing in the world, but not the easiest thing either to match those votes to precincts when it's not something you do all the time, right? That's going to be a bit of a technological and organizational challenge, correct?
Yeah, I think that's the main part is, you don't do this all the time. I think if you had all of the precinct captains be folks who work with data a lot, out of the 2,000 or so precincts, maybe there'd be like 20 errors or something like that. But you're talking about folks who are, in often cases, retired, don't deal with data very much, don't deal with even technology very much in some cases. There was the story about the tech manual for the iPads. So if you're having to explain how to turn on an iPad, you might have a rough time with this.
And then the second part of this is those people, those volunteers, and they really are. And I personally think there's something charming about this sort of individual participatory democracy. Maybe that has become so big and so important that it's not as charming if your campaign and millions of dollars have been spent on it. But it really is, citizens going out there and participating in their party's election plans. But what happens is, as you say, these are volunteers, often older people that got more involved. They're going to have to take those lists of the individual voter who voted, sometime last week, maybe at a different county, certainly in a different town, perhaps. Take those lists and then match them up for every voter. So with the caucus system, you have the first alignment and the second alignment. The first alignment is everybody says, "These are my first choices." The person running the caucus is going to serve as the proxy for those early voters and have to allocate them correctly. And then if that group isn't viable, if it doesn't reach the viability threshold, reallocate those votes. So if you're an early voter, you actually were told to vote for 3 to 5 candidates in order of preference, so that if when you voted last Saturday, you voted for, Tulsi Gabbard, but at your local precinct, Tulsi Gabbard's not reaching the viability point. Well, then you say, well, I want Pete Buttigieg. Well, what if Buttigieg isn't viable? Then you have to go to your third choice, which is, say, Bernie Sanders. That's something these volunteers are going to have to do repeatedly. And we just don't know how many times they're going to have to do that. What if you have a caucus, a precinct caucus, and I don't know, it has 150 people show up, but then there's 30 or 40 absentees? That's a lot of, figuring and refiguring and recalculating to do.
Yeah, Drew, that's a good point. I think especially on that sort of second ballot, like that's where there's going to be any kink in the hose. I think in just trying to reallocate that, which just makes me think of all those sheets I guess we saw on Twitter, all those precinct worksheets we saw coming out of Iowa, which sort of raises the question, which I think, Drew, you probably know the answer best. What type of information are we expecting to get out of Nevada? So in Iowa, this was sort of the first year that we had the state delegate equivalents plus the first round plus the final round. And what one thing we learned was that there was, for lack of a better word, general incompetence throughout the state in terms of even rounding and adding. So even beyond the issues of the application, there were also just basic math issues that were appearing on the precinct worksheets. What kind of information are we expecting to get out of from the Democratic Party in Nevada this weekend?
Very similar, but with a couple of twists. So yes, we will get the precinct data. They will also be providing it up through the county and the congressional district level, which is important because of how delegates are awarded. They don't do in Iowa. It was a contest for state delegate equivalents. In Nevada, they do it down a level to county convention delegates. Same sort of thing. That has an equivalency to the national delegates, which the party will be announcing. The twist, though, is twofold again. And you guys may know this. Alex Aldunson may know because you've gone through the delegate allocation. But I believe the difference is there's not necessarily a county convention um, element that's preset like there is in Iowa. It's based on turnout at the actual precinct caucus. So the multiplication number, it hasn't even been set yet, which will then have to be repeated several times. It's not complicated multiplication, but it can be kind of weird where you're just doing, something times 0.3758892, and you have to do it several times. It just, we don't do a lot of basic math. It's not hard, but it's just complicated in that way. And also the viability threshold at the precinct level isn't necessarily 15%. That also has to do with turnout and some other issues. So it seems there are a few more things that people are going to have to calculate that were at least known factors going into Iowa. They're sort of unknown and variable with the other variability of the absentee voters. So, obviously the original plan was there was an app that was going to handle all this and it would just be a much more plug and play kind of thing. I gather that's what they're trying to reproduce using this calculator tool, and Google Sheets, and also the ability to call into a hotline, which hopefully, that number won't become public this time, and you won't have people, trying to wait 2-3 hours to report these numbers or to ask questions. It looks like what's going to happen is the caucuses themselves start at noon Pacific time, so 3 Eastern. Um, However long it takes to actually conduct the caucus. Obviously, I think if we're going to see numbers early on, we'll see them from sort of the outlying areas where they'll be smaller, fewer people, less, um, you know, less complicating factors. They may not also have the early vote totals that a place like Clark County does. Um, to deal with. So the plan that, as I understand it from the Nevada Democrats, is they don't have a set schedule. They're not saying, hey, we're going to release it at 10%, 20%, 30%. They'll be releasing numbers as they intake them, are able to do whatever quality assurance checks they're going to do on in terms of math and make sure things work out. And then they'll be releasing them as they can. It's going to be a little bit of we'll see how it goes when we get there kind of factor, I think. Hopefully, in the last 2.5 weeks, they've been able to run through this, but I think it's a pretty heavy lift. So we're
At
just going
what
to have to see.
at what point do you think that we'd be able to tell if something's wrong? Like at what time, if we don't have results, that's like a red flag.
I would be guessing, and everything's guessing at this point. I would think if we don't see something in the first 2 hours or so, if you don't start seeing something from these outlying counties, which are really small. If you're not familiar with Nevada, there's Clark County, then way down the list is Washoe, and then way down the list is everyone else. Just in terms of population and the center of gravity, certainly in the Democratic primary or Democratic caucus. So if we don't see for some of these counties that are going to be producing a few thousand votes, then I think that's probably a red flag that there are even bigger issues. Because if you can't, if you're not having significant success in some of these more manageable sized areas, I just don't know what happens when you get to Clark. You get to Vegas and the suburbs.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess the sort of last piece I want to make on sort of the general context is in Iowa we hear a lot about the coin flips to decide a tie. And I think my favorite fun fact about the Nevada caucus is they pick a card from a deck, and whoever has the higher card, that's how they settle the tiebreaker, which is pretty fantastic if we think about it.
100% on brand.
Oh, definitely.